Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the 15th year that we have been holding these strategies for educational improvement conferences in partnership with our colleagues at the Kansas State Department of Education and the Kansas Alliance for the Arts. This is the second year that we've been doing this in a remote online a virtual format. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for the other three that we have, one next this Thursday and one next Tuesday and the Thursday after, all on topics that were brought to us by colleagues of yours from across the state that would be important at this point in time. I'm Rick Ginsberg. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Human Sciences, and we've started doing this as a way of getting the best and brightest from around Kansas and the region, across our university and other universities in this state, to try to provide a free day of professional development, in this case, several virtual days of professional development to help educators with the issues that they're facing these days. And certainly this year has been a year like none other, and we're facing a lot of rather unique situations. This conference this year and last is being hosted by our KU School of Education Human Sciences Global Education Academy. The Academy works with leading theorists, innovators, practitioners, other educators from around the world in online professional development, with options for earning micro learning credentials that are stackable towards graduate credit. More information on that is available at our Global Academy website. It's global-academy@ku.edu. Again, global-academy@ku.edu. And we've got a lot of exciting new offerings we'll be doing during the course of the next year and years ahead of us. The theme for this year is what we're calling Back to the Future, Time to Redesign. As we all start thinking about going back to our lives as quote unquote normally as we possibly can, get back into our classrooms and the like, we're trying to provide some workshops that will be useful to you in moving forward. Today's workshop is focusing specifically on the well-being of teachers and administrators. What a good time to be doing this. Some of you may have seen in the newspaper this morning, a report came out from the RAND Corporation just today that is called Job-Related Stress Threatens the Teacher Supply. And it reported that US teachers during the past year reported 78% of teachers reported frequent job-related stress this past year. That's as opposed to the whole total adult workforce in the country of only 40% reporting the same levels of stress. 78 versus 40. Symptoms of depression. US adults in general this past year, 10% reported that in their surveys. Teachers reported 27%. When teachers were asked what was the most stressful thing that they had to do, this will be no surprise to any of you that are classroom-based, it was around hybrid teaching and hybrid learning. So it's no surprise. I mean, the pandemic hit the world, and this was something, frankly, out of a nightmarish movie, more than anything any of us have ever experienced in our lives. Schools were closed, schools went online, people lost their jobs. We couldn't connect with all the students that we traditionally would be in our schools. The inequities that were inherent in our system, I think, were exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. Few educators were prepared for this, and we all know that. You add to that the racial tensions that rose this year, most prominently through the murder of George Floyd and other related events. We experienced the most contentious election in any of our lifetimes. We have the challenges of, for lack of a better term, fake news that seems to be spewed both online and on television on a daily basis. We all got into working as educators in something called spacing, wearing masks and having to talk about vaccines. There's been assaults on science, unlike any time in my lifetime. We've faced financial woes. I mean, I could go on. There's all sorts of new language, like things like Zoom. That was referred to an automobile before the pandemic. How many of us ever heard the words "you're on mute" before we started this pandemic? We now work in something called Microsoft Teams that we never worked on before. The question is, how do you cope? How do we deal with the social emotional issues that are impacting all of the educators in our buildings, as well, of course, as the students? Our speakers today are here to help us all think about ways of dealing with that and trying to address that. I'm going to introduce them one at a time right before they speak. We've asked each of our speakers to talk for about 15 minutes. Please, as you have questions that come up, don't go to the chat room, go to the Q&A section on the bottom of the Zoom, and we will deal with all of the questions at the end of the presentations. So let me begin with our first speaker, if I can. And our first speaker is Jenny Flinders. Jenny comes to us from KU. She is a research project manager with the University of Kansas Center for Public Partnerships and Research. Over her career, she supported community-based programming and early childhood developments in Kansas, with strong focus on that in the last 5 years. She works with indigenous communities on cultural, historical, and language revitalization efforts focused on childhood community health and intergenerational well-being. She recently authored an online learning module for family support professionals on historical trauma and community-centered healing. She also does a lot of narrative research through the use of sense-making and innovative mixed methods approach to sharing unique perspectives across communities. We're lucky to have Jenny as a doctoral student in our Education Leadership and Policies program. And with that, let me turn to Jenny Flinders to be our first speaker. Jenny?
Great, thank you. Here we go. I get to be the guinea pig to make sure the screen sharing works. Let's see, it does not look like I can share.
Sherry and the others, can we get Jenny to be able to share her screen?
Jenny, I just made you a co-host, so
Yep.
you should be able to share.
Looks like we're good now. Are we good? Can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to say anything other than hello. And I am Jenny, as Dr. Ginsburg said, and it's always a new experience to have someone read your bio for you in front of you. So today today, what I'm going to be sharing with you all out of that bit that Dr. Ginsburg shared about the work that I do is specific to the narrative research project that we run. And we have been at the center collecting stories and emergent patterns from those stories, which I'll share here in a minute, over the past really almost 3 years. And that put us in a really unique position to leverage the narrative work of hearing from Kansas families and practitioners in the middle of a pandemic, and what has come of this, and how we've been able to take those stories and take those patterns and work with state leaders, the Children's Cabinet, which sits under the governor's office, and working with KSDE, the Department of Education, as well as the Department of Health and Environment, the Department for Children and Families. They've all got their hands and in this work that we call Our Tomorrows, and have been actively using what we have found and what we are hearing and the decisions that they've made over the past year and a half. So I thought I would start off with a snippet from a story that we got somewhat recently. This is an active and ongoing project. So as of right this very minute, we are still hearing from folks who are participating and sharing their voices in this work. So, but this one, really has sat with me, and I thought this would just sort of set the tone for us today. And it says from an educator, an early childhood educator, where have all the smiles gone? As someone who works with small children, I have noticed some have stopped putting mouths and noses on the people they draw, just eyes. So with that in mind, we'll step into what this project is and how we have gone about collecting and using these narrative experiences in the work. So this is a lot of words. I'm not going to read it all. I have included this graphic illustration that we use sometimes that necessarily and intentionally illustrates how complex this can kind of be sometimes, and how we then try to help make sense of the process. But the idea is that there are complex problems. We often take quantitative and qualitative data to try to answer and propose interventions for those problems. But what Our Tomorrows does, by using what a tool called SenseMaker, is it allows participants to share an experience and then to make meaning of it themselves. So they go in and tell us, after they share the story that they want to share, what it means, who they are, where they're from, what was going on in the context of that experience, and what are the emotions tied to it. And then we can take all of that data and map patterns. And once we have patterns mapped, we can go back in then and read the stories that are emerging in those patterns. And then we take those back to the communities and have them make sense of it again. And so it becomes this sort of human sensor network, which the complexity folks like to use, and has really done some remarkable things during COVID. So really briefly, I think it's important to know who's in this story bank that we have. So for about the past 15 months, we have over 2,600 stories collected so far. And you can see some demographics about who these folks are. It leans very heavily female so far this year. That's not that surprising, given that we work primarily in the health and education spheres, and we have a lot of self-identifying females who participate in it. Some other categories that are sort of interesting, we've made some pretty big pushes to get rural voices in this. And one category that I've been particularly tracking, probably just because I am a single parent myself, but that is the experiences of single parents. And what I like to say when I talk about this, particularly in the context of providers or educators, is that, of course, those of you who are teaching children are often parents yourself too, right? So it's important to remember that when we're thinking about family experiences, that isn't so removed from a practitioner or an educator experience. And then the other thing that's really interesting about this tool is that it gives folks a way to tell us more about who they are in their own words. And so the tool itself generates these word clouds from what you're seeing are two different spaces where people are able to tell us more about who they are, how they identify, how they want to be represented, and then we get some densities in the clusters about that. But we're here to talk about stories. So some of the things that we've heard particular to educators and child experiences as families interact with the system. I'm trying to be really cognizant of time, so I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see that we've got kind of a span here of talking about a single father of young children who is trying to deal with remote learning and how it disrupted his ability to work. And then that compounds right into bills stacking up. And so someone in this instance is stepping in to help. We've got a high school administrator who is sharing a story about a student who is apologizing for not getting her work done. But that's also due to all of this compounded experience under single roofs, and not having good access to food, from not being in the schools, which I know we've all heard and gone through as we've gone through this pandemic period. And then some experiences shared here by a teacher of kindergarten, recognizing that, you know, her kids were looking a little bit wild and crazy, and having some emotional struggles, and realizing that, you know, she's just getting them back after they left for spring break and never came back for a year. So things that should not be surprising to see, but the real meat of how this works is that we get to see these things as emerging patterns, right? So what you're seeing here are, there's a question that folks are asked after they share a story that says, you know, what helped the family feel secure in this experience that you shared? And they plot this as a point on a triangle. So in the nexus between money and support and power, what helps you feel secure? And then as answers come in, they cluster into patterns, and then we can go in and loop into these patterns and actually see what is happening in the, you know, when someone has only a whole lot of support, or only feels power and not money, or, you know, we can look at any of these things and then actually read about what's happening in all of those instances. Rick, how am I doing? I realize I can't see my clock. Good, okay. Great. All right. And so the other way that we can look at patterns around these experiences is to have people tell us what is keeping them from thriving, what's disrupting the experience. So you can see here, this is just quantitative patterning of those stories, but in their own words, by their own answers, what is holding them back the most? And I have been tracking this month to month since the pandemic really started. And there are some really interesting things that we're learning. You can see that right now, mental health is on the rise, which, as Dr. Ginsburg shared in the beginning, we know is particularly a problem for educators. We also, interestingly, have seen a big dip in reports of internet and technology issues. And on the one hand, that really surprised me. And then as you think about it, like, actually, you know, 15 months into this thing, maybe we've got this figured out. Of course, we don't have this figured out for everybody, but that has been sort of an interesting thing to see reduce as self-reported problems that folks are facing. Unemployment and financial struggles have always been high. And we're also sort of tracking some rises in self-reports around childcare. And I think that that's to be expected too. As I said, you know, educators, staff are parents often too, and access to childcare when we all were just home with our children for so long is becoming a big concern. So I flew through that and I'm happy to go back and look at any stories, or maybe we can during the question and answer period. But I think the big takeaway here is that, you know, we every few weeks are feeding this back to our state directors of different agencies. We're taking the stories and the patterns out into communities and having them read them, and sitting with you know, teachers and educators and community members who are reading these experiences and then telling us what that means to them and what needs to happen. So like I said, this is a living research project. It's happening right now. We've had pretty big roles in how funds are distributed through the recovery period right now. So really looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and then making some good connections in the Q&A.
Jenny, thank you. And if you would stop sharing your screen, that was terrific, and you were within time. So you've set a very high bar for all your colleagues who are about to talk, and that's an amazing data set. It really is. So thank you for sharing that with us. Our next speaker is a faculty member here at KU. It's Dr. Arpita Ghosh. Arpita is an assistant professor of counseling psychology in our Department of Educational Psychology. She got her BA and MS degrees from Loyola University in Chicago and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. She's done pre-doctoral internship training at the University of Akron Counseling and Testing Center. Her career development in Context Lab focuses on context issues like race, ethnicity, and gender, and how that shapes the career decisions of underrepresented groups, specifically U.S. military veterans. She's most interested in individual and contextual factors that inform veterans' academic and career development in higher education and the civilian workforce. We were especially interested in having Arpita talk with us because the military obviously deals with a lot of pressure-laden situations on an ongoing basis, and might have some insights to share with us. So, Arpita, I'm proud to say I was the dean when you were hired, and I'm thrilled to have you speaking.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, perfect. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the current research I've been doing here at KU with my research team, with the hope that we can learn from the US military and the US military veterans about how to adapt to difficult situations, such as how to re-enter academic spaces during a global pandemic, while also maintaining our own well-being. So to give you a little bit of context about research on veterans and statistics around veterans, there's approximately 19 million veterans in the United States. And veterans are defined as individuals who've been discharged from the military. They separate from the military with the idea or with the intent to reintegrate into civilian life. And this reintegration includes successful participation in society, home, work, and school. So there's an existing body of research that says when they're service members in the military, adapt pretty well to difficult situations. This makes sense because military operations tend to be fast-paced in nature. They tend to require service members to demonstrate readiness and resiliency in the face of really stressful environments and situations. Military operations also expose service members to a lot of different stressors, such as demanding workloads, harsh and dangerous environments, and constantly having to change based on the situation. And these are all things we've noticed or experienced during the pandemic. So I want to briefly talk about a current study that we conducted. And what we did was we drew from existing research that says people react in different ways to change. So there's some theories coming out of the career development world and the higher educational world that say personal characteristics, such as how we're feeling, whether or not we feel hopeful, whether or not we feel optimistic about the future, how much stress we're experiencing, how much support we're getting or how much support we're not getting, impact how we adapt to these changes. And this is known as adaptability. And how we adapt to work-related changes, as you'll see on the screen, is noted as career adaptability. So all of these things impact how we have to change our situations to feel better. And then ultimately, it determines whether or not we're happy and whether or not we're engaged in what we're doing. So for this particular study, we were interested in examining specific constructs for US military veterans. So we recruited 418 self-identified veterans across the United States whose average age was 50. So data was collected in August 2020. So we included specific questions related to COVID and how COVID was whether or not COVID was affecting their employment status. So we found that half the sample of veterans were unemployed, and about a quarter of them noted significant barriers to finding employment. And these barriers included the pandemic, having to shift from full-time employment to part-time employment, having to change roles in homeschooling their children. And something else that the veterans noted were significant mental health concerns, as Dr. Ginsburg highlighted amongst higher education professionals, such as increases in depression, anxiety, and with the veteran population, they also were experiencing simultaneously other physical health injuries, including things like traumatic brain injuries. So all of those factors taken together impacted about a quarter of veterans and their employment status. So some of the variables that we looked at were stress, support, dimensions of well-being that included psychological, emotional, and social well-being, and two specific career-related variables, which are engagement and career adaptability. So stress sounds pretty straightforward in how we define it. So it was the amount of stress someone was experiencing. We were interested to determine if participants had a source of social support, specifically from friends, family, and significant others. We were also interested in the three dimensions of well-being. So under psychological well-being, we were interested in whether or not participants were having positive relationships with each other, if they demonstrated any personal growth, if they felt autonomous at all, and whether or not they felt like they had a purpose in their life. In terms of emotional well-being, we were interested in how happy they were in their lives and how satisfied with their lives they were. In terms of social being, we were interested in learning about how much they felt they were able to contribute to society and how interested they were in maintaining social relationships. In terms of engagement, we wanted to know how engaged they were in finding work or talking about work-related constructs with others, and how willing, if they were unemployed, how willing they were to change their behaviors to find work. And lastly, we were interested in career adaptability. So how participants, if they felt like they could adapt to the changing world of work, and what went into that. So we had two primary research questions. So first, we just wanted to know the relationships amongst all of these variables. And then we wanted to know what factors in particular predicted military veterans' career adaptability. So what made them stand out? What made them feel like they could adapt to the changing world of work? What resources did they bring with them from their military experiences? So what we found was kind of what we expected. So there were significant positive correlations among psychological well-being, emotional well-being, social well-being, engagement, sources of support, and career adaptability. So as veterans were endorsing more aspects of well-being, they were more engaged, they felt more support, they had more support from these different entities, and they felt like they could actually make some changes in regards to the world of work. Conversely, we found negative correlations between some of these variables and stress, which conceptually also makes sense. If we're not feeling well, if the veterans weren't feeling well, if they were not happy with how their relationships were going, if they didn't feel like they had enough support, they were incredibly stressed out. And lastly, we wanted to test some predictive relationships. So we found when we were testing a regression that there was a significant effect between all of these variables in predicting career adaptability. But more specifically, emotional and psychological well-being and engagement were the significant predictors of career adaptability. So what does that all mean? What's the big takeaway? So first off, even though we studied veterans, I think these constructs can be applied to teachers and administrators, and educators in general, because as we've noted before, we're all experiencing very similar things. So the first things our findings tell us is to increase emotional well-being. So some ways to do this are staying connected with others. Some veterans in our study were participating in support groups or teletherapy through the Veterans Administration system, and they were staying connected with each other through these types of groups. They had the ability to talk to each other when things weren't going well. So another recommendation is to increase psychological well-being. And some ways to do this are through mindfulness and meditation. And speaking out of the context of veterans for a second, it's also important to develop mental health awareness training for educators and administrators to focus both on emotional and social learning. So I know I shared a lot of information in a short time, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have during the Q&A, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists.
So this is this has to be pandemic driven, but this is the first time I've ever facilitated a panel where the first two speakers were under the time that we allotted them. So I applaud you both for that. Our third speaker, another assistant professor here at KU, Ambalia Thomas. She's an assistant professor in teaching English to speakers of other languages, or TESOL, in our Department of Curriculum and Teaching. Dr. Thomas is a critical applied linguist. She teaches in the TESOL area, and she studies teaching, learning, and language using that term broadly. She draws upon language-based qualitative methods in her research to address what another scholar calls testimonial injustices, committed against social actors, in particular individuals considered non-native and non-standard speakers of American English. She's very active in a number of professional activities, and has, as a linguist, has really brought a frame to our programs and to our students that I don't think they normally will get in an education school. And as I said with Arpita, I'm really pleased to have been here and been able to have a hand in bringing Ambalia to us. She has actually been doing a lot of work on helping people think of ways of coping in these very difficult times. So let me turn it over to Ambalia Thomas. Ambalia, thank you for being here.
Hi, so thank you, Rick, for the introduction, first of all. I'm going to take a slightly different approach from my colleagues. I'm going to take the storytelling approach that Jenny introduced at the beginning, and just start off by telling my personal story and using that story to frame some of the contemplative pedagogies that I've adopted as an instructor and that I use with my students. So one of the things that Rick mentioned as he was mentioning this report at the beginning of the webinar is that this pandemic has been really rough for a lot of people. And I have to say, and I have to admit, that I'm one of these people for whom the pandemic has been an absolute godsend. It has really reshaped my life. It has given me space from all of the challenges that I felt like I was experiencing in my day-to-day environment, the stresses of teaching, the commuting, the going back and forth, just a lot of challenges that I faced in my own process of coming and becoming a teacher educator. So the pandemic was not easy, but it was a reprieve from some of the other stressors that I was facing in my career. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll segue into how these previous experiences prepared me for the pandemic. I had moved to Kansas. I had never been to Kansas before. I moved to teacher education. I was an applied linguist. And one of my struggles was really figuring out a way to help my students and my colleagues understand how to look at teaching and learning through language. That in and of itself was a challenge. I was new to a small town. I had never lived in a town smaller than the city of Atlanta or Tucson. And so I had a lot of adjustment issues. I moved to Kansas at a time where issues of policing were very stressful for people of color, especially African Americans. Life was stressful. And so I started seeking out contemplative approaches to managing my everyday work and personal stresses. I started meditating. I started thinking about ways of adopting what a Michigan professor, Riyad Shah Jahan, calls being lazy and slowing down. I love any kinds of terms that sound a little uh, that sound a little progressive, that sound like they're trying to change and bend and shift the system. And so I was really drawn to this idea of being lazy and slowing down, and how one can adopt this approach in a classroom and with students and still be seen as someone who is on task, who is working hard for their students and encouraging their students to work hard. As I started researching these contemplative practices, and I've dropped into the link, I've dropped into the chat a link to this tree of contemplative practices, so that any of you who are not familiar with these practices can see the variety of meditative and silencing activities that one can draw upon. For me, these were really centering and grounding for me in terms of thinking about my instruction. As I've delved into this area of contemplative practices, I've actually explored new ideas and new concepts that people are bringing to the space, such as rest as resistance. So there is a woman out of Atlanta who calls herself the Nap Bishop. Maybe some of you have heard of her, but her whole thing is that we really have to resist these neoliberal tendencies to work and continue to overwork. These are the frameworks that were shaping my thinking about instruction when the pandemic hit. I had already been working to slow down the pace of instruction in my classroom, to slow down the expectations that I had for my students, so that the focus wasn't on producing and production, but on deeper learning and thinking. So when the pandemic hit and we were forced to pivot, we were forced to slow down and take a week or two to actually plan our classes, I was ready. And that space of having to really think through my lessons, but in particular, how I would assess students was something that I welcomed when the pandemic arrived. Don't get me wrong, this pandemic has been terrible for humanity. It has harmed a lot of people. People have lost jobs. It's been stressful for a lot of people, especially people with kids who are having to work and help their children learn at the same time. Pandemic has not been great, but it has afforded an opportunity for those of us who've already been stressed out or who are more introverted by nature. It's afforded us an opportunity to do life and living in a slightly different way. And so with that thought, I started to design my classes to think about the needs that my students might have as learners, to reflect on the needs that I, as an instructor, had. I'm going to pause for a second and just kind of collect my thoughts, because this is one of the approaches that I really encourage my students to do, that when you are nervous or when you feel like you have to perform, to just kind of center yourself and think about what it is you really communicate. So I hope you all are receptive to that. I know it probably sounds a little hokey, especially as an academic, but I assure you, when I need to be in academic mode, I am there. But I feel like this is a very personal discussion that needs to be had. And it's really about how we slow down in order to do our work most effectively, and to do it effectively on behalf of our students and with our students. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the changes that I made in my classrooms. that draw from these contemplative practices, these being lazy and slowing down practices, and what they've done for me and what they've done for my students. One of the things I've done in my classrooms is I've rethought assessments. We have to assess students, but we don't always have to assess students in very specific or particular ways. And so I've reimagined the kind of knowledge that I want my students to produce for me. So while the focus of this talk isn't on students, it's really about what refocusing has done for me as an instructor. So it's allowed me to rest. It's allowed me to not have to spend so much time grading. It's allowed me to look at my students' work a little more holistically, to be able to provide them with feedback that is useful for them. And that is reflective of the fact that they don't have a lot of time to spend on reading my comments. So I picked 3 approaches, and they are noticing, pondering, and providing, okay? Noticing, pondering, and providing. And with this idea of noticing, what I wanted to focus on in terms of assessing, and remember, I'm really talking about assessing students, letting them demonstrate what they know and what they understand. I reimagined my quizzes. And instead of focusing on students providing right or correct responses, the focus of my quizzes was on providing an opportunity for students to think about and to creatively reflect on what they've been reading. And they have to provide evidence to support whatever ideas they are writing about, right? And this focus, this shift from correct and not correct to providing evidence was really fun for me to observe in terms of how students responded on their quizzes. They actually had to go through the readings and support their ideas. They had to cite pages and then provide a reference at the end, which was just an approach to quizzing that really just, it shook their world. They thought, you know, this isn't how quizzing is supposed to be done, but it actually provided them with an opportunity to read more deeply. And at the end of the day, I think that's what most of us as educators are looking for, students to engage with material more deeply. So I'll give you an example of the kind of question that I gave to students. Students had to read a chapter on culturally responsive pedagogy. And the quiz was a short answer question quiz. The question or the quiz prompt was this: there is a recurring theme expressed across Mitchell 2010. One of the key themes expressed in this chapter is that culturally responsive pedagogy provides an opportunity for and allows students to strengthen blah. And so they had to fill in the blank. And with this blah or this X or this blank, it allowed for flexibility of knowledge. It allowed for students to choose that idea or concept that most resonated for them in the reading. So there's no correct answer. But then they actually had to provide 2 to 3 sentences to support that statement. They had to provide a page reference, and then they had to provide a short reference at the end of their quiz. It was beautiful. No one could pretend to read. And so they had to actually deeply read the text and support their ideas. So for me, that's this aspect of noticing. What are students noticing in their assignments rather than what can students regurgitate and repeat back to me, and probably in a way that I could just pick up from the text and read myself. So getting students to notice. The other change that I made in class in terms of assessments, and especially in the moment, discussion-based or lecture-based assessments, is this idea of pondering. And so in class on our Zoom lectures, and I actually did not require students to turn on their cameras. They never had to turn on their cameras for me unless they wanted to. I wanted to give them space to be relaxed. I wanted them to stay in their pajamas. They could stay in bed for all I care. Some of them didn't show up and they just, were virtually online, but that was okay for me. For those who showed up, I gave them questions to ponder. And from the middle of the semester to the end of the semester, I actually got students coming to Zoom class because I wasn't lecturing to them. I was giving them questions to ponder. And I was recentering my normal teaching self that's usually in front of the classroom lecturing. I recentered that to the question, and then to students' relationship to that question, and thinking about pondering, sitting in silence with that question, and then offering ideas or commentary if they so chose. So let me give you an example of the type of question that I ask students to ponder, because the question is actually really important. The idea is to help students feel like, especially pre-service teachers, help them feel like they are actually engaging in the process of thinking through instruction and pedagogy in deep ways. So one of the questions was this, and it's kind of an in-your-face, well, that's not in your face, but it's a question that I think students probably think, or an issue that students think about, but don't feel like they can talk about. So here's the prompt. Teachers have a lot of power that they wield over students in the classroom. Think about the ways in which this power surfaces in the classroom, either at the university level or at K through 12 schools. So then we talk about this question. We talk about what power looks like. We talk about the ways in which power shapes instruction, who gets to ask questions, who doesn't get to ask questions, how the way in which teachers even ask and present questions invites a specific type of response, and what students do in turn to try to combat that type of power in class. These are questions that are related to our pedagogical practice in the classroom. How do we make space for our students to really present themselves and their ideas without feeling the pressure to produce a response? So that was what this classroom prompt was about. Asking this prompt and letting students kind of sit with the question just unleashed so many responses from my students. Many of the students turned on their cameras in the middle of my asking and probing with this prompt. They sat, they thought about it for a couple of minutes, about 5 minutes, and then just one after another, they all started to, not all, 10 of them chimed in, 10 out of 20, but 10 out of 20 is all when you are working with college students during a pandemic.
And Molly, about 2 minutes.
Thank you. I will wrap up. The last idea, or the last contemplative practice that I engaged in is providing. And I won't go into that. You can ask questions about it at the end if you're interested. But again, I'm still delving into these contemplative ways of inviting response and knowledge from students. Contemplative pedagogy is all about building in space and time for silence, for thinking, for providing a response. It's very student-centered. It forces us as educators to step back so that we are not constantly giving out all of this energy into the classroom. It forces students to take up some of this space. And so as we think about moving into the classroom, some of you might be like me, you're nervous about going back, not just because of the pandemic, but because of all the extra energy and socialization and socializing that it requires. Think about ways in which you can simplify, slow down, be lazy in your teaching practice. And being lazy doesn't mean not showing up prepared. It means allowing space for the miracle of your experiences, years of teaching experiences, to show up and guide you in terms of how you teach and work with students. So many of us know so much more about teaching than we give ourselves credit for. But when we slow down, we take a breath before we address our students, it's amazing how effective and impactful we can be with them. And they sense that we are being honest and authentic, and they respond to it. So thank you very much for your time.
And Balia, thank you. And again, folks, on any of these, any questions, please put them in the Q&A section of at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our last speaker brings us someone who is working directly in the K-12 space. Jacqueline Rodriguez serves as the multilingual community, serves the multilingual community in the Kansas City, Kansas Public Schools as the ESOL and Migrant Programs Director. She dedicates her time to integrating language learning into classrooms to provide inclusion and equity for all students. She's a proud Surge Academy alum, and she's been able to elevate her leadership skills as a Latina in education, focusing on transforming the urban education experience and expanding opportunities for our youth in the urban schools. She's a long advocate and encourages recruiting, retaining, and supporting teachers of color. And she leads with the belief that all students have a voice, deserve teachers who look like them or have shared experiences. She's a PhD candidate in the doctoral program in our colleague University Baker in Baldwin. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing from your voice from the K-12 space.
Thank you for having me, and I'm very appreciative to sit on this panel just to hear the research that's going on and the stories. I'm also going to take the same storytelling approach as Dr. Thomas and kind of talk through my experience as well as some of the pieces that we've taken away and we're implementing on the ground in the K-12 area. And so I just want to add, while currently I have the privilege of serving as the director, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was actually an instructional coach for the district in the ESL department. And so I served 10 out of our 28 elementary buildings. So really March to right up into summer of 2020, I was boots on the ground with teachers in everything that was going on. So going from that really teacher centered experience to spending some time in the summer talking about reentry and then transitioning into a role. I think it was Dr. Ginsburg that said this has probably been his most difficult year out of all of his times. And a lot of people will ask, how's the new role for you? And I don't have anything else to compare it to, because starting a new position in the middle of a pandemic is probably the toughest it will be. So I'm hopeful that it's only up from here in that. But one of the things that on that teacher side, and we're thinking about K-12, is the pain that was felt across our state, within our communities, and then across the United States. There was a lot of teacher pain just thinking about leaving for spring break and getting that announcement that we've got to slow down and everything is getting shut down, and then to kind of work quickly. Well, I felt very connected to a lot of what Dr. Thomas said in the K-12 arena. We really have to hit the ground running. We did get some time for planning, but it was a constant go and push to build curriculum for our students. And that's what we're in the business to do, to ensure that our students are meeting those standards, but then refining what it is that we were teaching them. And then even more so thinking about when we come back again, because we're on summer break now, and it's not just the reentry of getting into buildings, because I can speak from our district. Our kids did not come back until April of 2020, 2021. So we were about a year out of schools, where our counterparts in some of our neighboring counties and our neighboring communities here in Kansas, especially those rural cities, they started right back in September of 2020. So our kids really had to experience reentry. We're experiencing summer school. But again, all of our students will be reentering our buildings, meaning all of our teachers are going to have to build up that stamina. So how do we support that? And I think really that comes to holding space. KU is holding space for us to talk about all of the things that are going on in the research side. What are the stories of families telling us? What can we learn from other researchers to bring in? And interestingly enough, one of the articles that I had pulled from the Johns Hopkins School of Educational Journal also referenced veterans and what they're learning. And they talked a little bit of the acronym PI, so proximity to the front line. How do we ensure that all of our teachers, all of our support staff, and our administrators are close to that front line of what's going on? And that's our students. How do we get everyone to integrate, to touch, to see students at whatever level that they're at? That's including our bus drivers, our nutritional staff people. Everyone needs to be on the front line engaging with our kids, even within the social distancing, the masks. It is all hands on deck to get our smallest of children integrated into those procedures. So at the administrator side, it was a lot of attention to detail. Then the I was immediacy. How do we interact with issues before they escalate? How do we engage with the things that need an automatic response, opposed to things that we can kind of let and simmer, take some time and think through, and then move forward? And I think that's something we have to take into reentry. How do we disaggregate between those items that are hot and they need a response right away, because that is what is going to ensure that our teachers are moving, or our teachers with students. And then the E was a strengths-based focus on to normalize response time. So going back to that immediacy, understanding that sometimes the response won't be as quick as we had anticipated. And I think for educators, it's really hard, because we want to ensure that we know what the expectation is, and that we meet the expectation or we exceed the expectation. And what we've learned is that things change very quickly as we're considering all of the different county expectations. I can speak towards Wyandotte County. They had much stricter mandates for us, and that is a huge barrier into bringing our kids back, and it will continue to be a barrier as we move in towards August. And what is full capacity? Will we have masks? Will we not? And how do we ensure that our teachers also feel safe? Should they feel that the district is making a wrong issue? And I think part of that normalcy is to be able to say that we've made a mistake and we need to rethink and go back to the drawing board. And then the last piece of that pies was simplicity. Let's just keep it simple. And I think that that's a huge part of what we need collectively, is to keep the sentiment simple of what reentry looks like. And more so, I kind of, focusing on those things of the pandemic, but even more so thinking about moving into August. And, Education Weekly said that 84% of teachers were feeling more stressed than they have ever felt before, which leads into, I think it was about a quarter of teachers saying that they're ready to resign and either change positions out of districts or leave the teaching field altogether, which really has an effect on what we can offer for that August reentry for our students. We really feel the effects of the teacher shortage, which we had before the pandemic, and I think it's even escalated now, and retaining teachers. And that's a huge point of passion for me, is to ensure that we are putting in the professional development that keeps teachers here. But we know, just as this series is free to educators and they can hop on between March of 2020 all the way up to November of 2020, the amount of information that went out to educators, the amount of people that had time to create content was overwhelming. I had the opposite effect of slowing down, where my anxiety ramped up and I had to shut down because I couldn't intake any more information. And as one of the other panelists said, as a parent and a single parent myself, to support teachers to still do an instructional coach job of co-teaching or modeling lessons on an online platform while still having my kindergartner in the background trying to do kindergarten was one of the most stressful moments, I think, within the year. But again, going back to that word of normalizing, we have to normalize a lot of these things that our community has felt, what our teachers feel. And as administrators, we often say we're a family. Family comes first, and we really need to normalize that and show those steps. I think that goes into steps that we need to take for reentry, for supporting teachers, for supporting administrators as well, because they are not anomalies and don't have families or children. They do as they do, and we have to create space for that, because we've seen research that's showing that the amount of daycare providers has decreased, the amount of funding for some of these organizations is gone. So we have to find ways to change the system that seems kind of unchangeable at the K-12 level. And then just some other pieces that as I was kind of reading and prepping for this and have been focusing on over the last year is this refocus from top down when we're considering from that administrator level to the teacher level, but also from inside out and evaluating ourselves and our reflective practice as a teacher, as an administrator, as a parent. What are my core values and how do I ensure that those are shared to my students? How is that shared to my administrator? How is that shared to my colleagues so that they know what I'm able to produce? And then collectivism. We have to work collectively to ensure that we can pick up the slack as we're normalizing some of these other pieces. And that's a huge piece where we have seen what isolation can do. And I heard someone reference Microsoft Teams, and how do we utilize those platforms now to ensure that we're not working in silos and in isolation, that we can still continue to provide the most excellent education for all of our students as they're coming back without the after effects of the burnout, of the exhaustion, and just taking time to, again, from inside out, knowing how am I personally feeling and what is the output that I can provide today. Are just some of the pieces as I considered what does reentry look like? What have I reflected on from interacting with teachers and sitting in a lot of Zooms with people in tiers, not just in my district, but also colleagues from neighboring districts, and then moving into the administrator role of what do I need to provide to the 70 plus teachers that I support, considering the size of our district, and then the instructional coaches who support those teachers, and how can we ensure that we're walking the same path and not paths that are going to veer away from what we're all here for in education is our students. So those are just a little reflective pieces. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my experience, as well as kind of connecting all of those pieces and giving the perspective of that K-12 experience from the teacher to the administrator, and still continually to reflect and grow on my own practice and putting that voice out as I will leave this Zoom and into another meeting, and the meetings that we continue to have within my district and across the state of Kansas, talking about reentry and how we will continue moving forward, growing our students.
Get off mute, Rick. Jacqueline, thank you for that. To our audience, we've got almost 60 people here. We are now open to answering questions. We have one live question. It's for Amalia. It said, I'd like to hear more about your reflective questioning. You said that you get about 10 to 20 students responding and engaged. I love this idea and did this with some of my high school students, but it's difficult for me to let go of what to do with the others who are not engaging. What did you do with the non-engagers?
Right. You know, since we're on Zoom and students do not have to show their faces, you don't actually see the non-engagers, but you can assume that they're engaging. And if they're not engaging on one particular question, Another day, they may engage on that particular question. And so I think the key is to really try to understand who your different students are, what categories of students you have, what are some of the concerns that these students have. For me, in terms of what it means to become a teacher, those are the kinds of students that I'm working with. They are pre-service teachers, they're thinking about their teaching career. And so I work to find questions for them to ponder that allow them to think about working with English language learning students in different ways. And I find on different days, I get different students. When I'm talking about the linguistic aspects of students and their learning, I get a whole other class of students. So I would say different days, find different kinds of questions to ponder. Shift those questions a little bit in terms of what they challenge students to think about. Perhaps the questions don't have to be so personally based. So with the example that I gave earlier, one element of the question that I had students think about is the ways in which they try to signal who they are to their teachers and to their classmates, and how that signaling of ourselves is an important part of being in a classroom, that it's something that we as educators learn to tune into and use that information to reach and engage with our students. And yeah, so I could keep going on, but hopefully that provides you with some idea of how I try to reach different categories of students on different days.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. And others, as you have questions, do jump in. I was originally going to be on this panel, and we didn't want to have too many speakers, but I'll just talk just for a few minutes. I had actually been doing some work focusing on administrators. And as I'm looking at what I did here, I think actually much of what we found applies to teachers as well. So maybe I'll share that. And the work that we did was focusing what we called becoming emotionally adaptable leaders. And we actually collected a good bit of data from educators across Kansas, and believe it or not, educators across one province in Canada, in British Columbia. We found there were, we started off with, okay, so what are the issues that cause you emotional distress as an educator, with specific focus on the pandemic, of course, that's what we were looking at. Because while being a teacher or being an academic administrator always has its levels of emotional stress, it was all heightened, obviously, during what we went through. And we found that there were like this 7 or 8 categories. The first one, the biggest one, was what we called gnawing uncertainty. And that was around safety, financial impact, worries, technology needs in terms of hardware, software. Many teachers at K-12 in the higher education space had never taught online. Now you were only teaching online. So the gnawing uncertainty was fairly common. Second one was the rapidity of change and circumstance that struck us. And it was, you all go back, it's kind of hard to believe it was over a year ago, but just imagine how quickly. I remember vividly that I was at a reception on a Saturday in March, down on the plaza with one of our donors, and we were all talking about going to the KU basketball tournament on Friday, the Big 12 tournament. And school was closed on Wednesday, and we weren't back for quite some time after that. And it was like that in every space. And as Jacqueline pointed out, it was the only district in the state of Kansas that was closed from March to March 20 to 21. That happened all very quickly. Certainly there was an exacerbation of equity concerns, especially at the K-12 space. Large percentage of students were hard to reach. What did I read? Was it in Los Angeles County? They indicated that during this first 6 months of the pandemic, they were not in contact with 28% of the students in the school district. I mean, these are huge numbers of kids. Health fears was a big deal for all of us. Still should be, frankly, but certainly was heightened before there was anything called a vaccine, when we were all being talking about masking and staying away from one another and the like. Personal exhaustion was a common theme with everybody. I think more so probably for caretakers who were also working full time. A number of you, both Jacqueline and Jenny, indicated you're single parents, and if you're working remotely and also having to teach your kids, well, you know that story better than I, and how difficult that was for everybody. Let's see, work-life balance, that gets at the working with your family and working jobs. Many people were losing their jobs. That was a big fear. And then finally, the unknowns related to the effects on students. And what we did is, after spending a good bit of time working with administrators and looking through several hundred studies on leadership, we found that there were 12 things that were recommended for becoming an emotionally adaptable leader that I think probably fit teachers as well. I'll go through these quickly and then get to the questions. The first one is that we all have to embrace uncertainty. If nothing else, this pandemic has taught us that people who think in a linear way are going to run into a lot of trouble if you ever walk into a classroom, because that's not how they work. The research on this is called complex adaptive systems. It's another line of research completely, but this certainly came to the fore during the pandemic. Accepting that leadership / teaching involves emotional experiences. If you try to wipe them out, you're not a teacher, from my perspective. One of the great teachers of teachers was years ago taught me that that you can't be a good teacher unless you make the classroom into your family. And I remember I was working in K-12 at the time. I said, so how many students can I have in a class? He said, no more than 18. That's a big family. But the bottom line is, I think that still holds this business about the emotional level of what we do. 3, learn to become flexible and adaptive. We have people in Kansas doing good work on resiliency. That's at the heart of this, one's ability. That's what at the core of a lot of the social emotional learning that I think that we teach. Know yourself and those that you work with. Know your own emotions and how you can control them. A lot of bad leaders don't know how to do that. I think probably the same is true for teachers. 5th, allow yourself to hope and dream. There's a great researcher, his name is Andy Hargraves, and he always argues that your success is motivated by an inspiring dream. And to be successful and adaptive, dreaming, I think, is really an important part of it. 6, understand that people and personal relations rule. This comes out of work on what they call collective leadership. Michael Fullan, the great scholar on change, has written that great leaders, great teachers understand that you've got to let the group change the group. Doesn't work real well this way. It doesn't work real well this way. Works well when that's together. Lots of research on resiliency, but I think the best research coming out is on what they call hardiness. So hardiness is like grit, and it's mindfulness and it's resilience, all kind of flipped together. And it's an area that I suggest that you look at if you want to get a sense of what you have to be hardy to get through. I think what we've all lived through here. Setting a positive tone is really important. There's great work on what's known as emotional work and emotional labor. That original research was actually done on flight attendants on planes. If you've ever been on a plane, we've seen a lot of things going on now, but flight attendants take crap from everybody, and they always smile, and they're right. I mean, that's the emotional work in a job. As a leader, it's like you're never supposed to cry or shed a tear or things like that. But as a teacher, you're in front of the kids, and you're the de facto parent while you're there. So that emotional work is difficult. Setting a positive tone is important, even when you might not have positive feelings yourself. Promote shared values of trust and integrity. Being honest is a key for success, I think, in any endeavor. The great basketball coach John Wooden once said, there is no pillow as soft as a clear conscience. And that's one of my favorite sayings ever, that you as a leader, I found that I've got to share the crap that's going on. If I hide it, it doesn't do you any good. It's been a big issue at KU, and I think a big issue all across our country. 10, taking stock. What does that mean? We teach you as teachers that if you're going to teach kids to learn, you have to provide them a valuable corrective feedback. And you know what? You as a teacher should demand that back from the students or your leaders, and we as leaders should demand it from the people that we work with. You can't get better unless you know how you're doing. We have to take stock. You need corrective feedback. The 11th one we found was being prepared. This comes out of the crisis management work. And what it suggests is that it's good to start thinking about this, having a plan for how you're going to deal with things. Two of the great writers on emotional intelligence, David Caruso and Peter Salovey, talk about people developing an emotional blueprint or plan for themselves for how they're going to deal with things. And I think that's a really wonderful strategy. And last but not least, this comes out of the leadership on wisdom that comes out of the University of Chicago. And what they call for is that wise leaders learn patience. I think that's at the heart and body of what you were talking about to some degree. Learn to control emotions, emotional regulation is important. Learn to accept reality and don't stifle emotions that you're going to confront. So this is what we learned in studying leaders. I think much of that applies to this business of dealing with emotions and some of the business that we've been dealing with in the K-12 space. We had, let's see, I don't see any other questions. Did the panel members have any questions for their colleagues before we settle down? Final words, Jenny or Ambalia or Arpita or Jacqueline?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share a couple extra thoughts. I been taking notes as everyone has been sharing their thoughts and stories and work. So thank you, all of you, for doing that. One of the things I kept writing and circling over and over is I think Jacqueline, you used the word collectivism, but it was definitely in what was shared across everyone's presentations. And one of the things that we have been finding in our data status and in the voices is that right, like we don't do a very good job of not just identifying collective needs, but then offering collective approaches to solutions, right? And we had shared some feedback with the state that families, we were reading a lot of stories about families that just didn't have access to the technology. Technology is expensive, right? So maybe you have internet, but if you don't have a phone or you don't have a tablet, then what good is that, right? And stories of parents sitting in Taco Bell, parking lots to try to get their kids on their phones with their limited data plans to just do homework, right? And so we were able to get funds out actually to support just the buying of devices, which never happens in grant funding, especially. And what we found, just to speak to this point that I'm really pondering now, thinking about, is that that might have been for particular pockets of needs, but actually, and not just for home visiting for young kids, but that, right, their older siblings could then do their classwork too. Students with special needs were able to make their appointments. We had reports of parents being far less, parents who were struggling within the judicial system and trying to make court appointments could finally make them because it was allowed to be online, right? And you didn't have to struggle with the transportation issue and the work issue, and just thinking about, like, so now what do we do, right? Because if we just flip back to the way things were before, and we got ready to collectively try to solve things and recognize how connected everything is, there's an anxiety there about not holding on to that moving forward. So just offering that, I guess, as some thoughts to what you all have shared, and the need for us to keep thinking that way and do it even more and even better.
Anyone else? Jacqueline?
Yeah, I did notice someone kind of talked a little bit about the compliance pieces that educators have had to work through, special education, English as a second language, the amount of paperwork that has been brought on. I can speak to special education of having to rewrite IEPs to ensure that we're in compliance. If kids are remote or in person, if they go back and forth, some of those pieces in terms of what my department really had to focus on was language assessments on students who weren't physically here, and to be able to talk to a kid who most likely is in their silent period silently on the phone, or teaching them how to navigate Zoom while still trying to assess them, and bringing in over 9,000 kids to come in and do a state assessment. Those are those pieces that Jenny, I think, was talking a little bit about, that collective. Unless you share that information with someone, they can't take that and do something else with it. So I think another piece for us as we move forward as teachers or as educators is advocacy. But I think furthermore, with advocacy, it's not just advocating for what we need and saying that this is a reason for burnout, but also what are those solutions and who are the right people to advocate to? Because a lot of K-12 education, I know higher education as well, is mandated by certain things that come from the federal and state government that we really need to rethink some of these pieces and the equity of practice that they are there, and some items like the FAPE-free and equitable education are there for a reason, but how do we leverage that to ensure that we're not burnt out at the end of another year and we're retaining teachers? So I just encourage, advocate for what you're needing and for your students, and as an administrator, what other needs you have, and not just inside the school system, but outside.
Pete, I found it, yeah, your stuff very interesting. I remember years ago studying teacher stress, and we found that the stress levels amongst teachers were significantly higher than bomber pilots in World War II. Now, I would argue that one is, there's a life and death thing in one and not the other, but the difference was, as you pointed out, that people are trained to deal with those levels of stress in the military. And what your research found was that the stress came not from being, in the field. It came from leaving the military and having to deal with finding a job and being back into quote unquote normal culture.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, Rick, both you, Jacqueline and Jenny, what resonated with me in all three of your presentations was this idea of pivoting and trying to adapt to this changing culture. Like, when we initially received funding from KU for this project, we weren't expecting the pandemic. So we had to sit down and rethink all of these questions when we were going to go do research with people who had left the military, and think about, well, does it make sense to ask about their well-being now versus, pre-pandemic times? So I appreciate you letting me think about that a little bit more.
Yeah. Ambalia, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of piggyback on what everyone is saying. And, for me, this issue of stress and well-being and kind of adjusting is all, this is what contemplative practices is all about. A lot of what I think is creating a lot of stress for teachers is this feeling that we have very limited control over our time, over our life, over the expectations that are being asked of us. And that can be incredibly stressful, even more stressful than facing death in many ways. And so as I work with student teachers, my job is to help re-empower them, to let them know that they have options about the ways in which they approach problems, and that they need to approach these problems in creative ways and in community. And so, just really thinking about the ways in which we can address the limited powers that we as educators sometimes find ourselves faced with, and thinking creatively, thinking strategically, slowing down enough so that we can get these creative ideas. All of this is very important. And I've really enjoyed working with student teachers during the pandemic to challenge them to engage in these new ways of thinking about their practice, and how we don't always have to be busy and moving to be learning deeply. And I think that's something that as a profession, we have to really embrace a little bit more, that learning and engagement does not always have to be physically visible to be present.
Thank you. So we are coming on near the end of our time. There is a participant survey that I'm guessing will be emailed to people so we can get your feedback. for coming. Let me see. Wait a minute. Something was posted here. It is posted in the chat on the chat room now from Jane McManus. Thank you, Jane, for posting that. So those of you that are still with us, we have still over about 55 of you still here. Please take a few minutes to help us think about this. Our next session 2, our next stage in this comes on Thursday this week, and I believe on that one we will be focusing on the social emotional needs of our students, and we certainly all care for students as educators, and so it's an important issue for us as we start thinking about coming back. I was really struck, Ginny, right at the beginning with your comment about the paintings that when was it a kindergarten teacher talked about, where they're just posting painting eyes, and there's a TV commercial now where they have art done by people who are manic depressive or something, and I was thinking, oh my God, it looks like that stuff. It's awfully unsettling. A couple of questions about slides and recording and the like. It'll be on the Global Education Academy website. And again, that website is, bear with me one second, I'll find it. It is global, GLOBAL academy@ku.edu. I'm really struggling with this because people take care of me here and they write things out, and they wrote global academy. So global academy@ku.edu. You can get, we'll be posting this and any other PowerPoints that we had for you at that point. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I especially thank Ginny and Arpita and Mbalia and Jacqueline for sharing their time and expertise with us. It was a great start for us for this summer, and we'll look forward to seeing many of you at the next sessions later this week and the 2 that we have next week. Take care.